Good evening, everyone. We're going to give people a minute to log in. All right, we're going to give people a couple more seconds to log in, and then we will get started. Perfect. Okay, it looks like our numbers are settling. So welcome everyone to our junior parent nights. My name's Chelsea, and I'm going to be helping out with the Zoom today. So we have two amazing panelists. We have Jared, our Senior Director of Test Prep, and Jessica, our Senior Director of Academics. The structure of today's meeting, we're going to be kind of breaking it up into those big domains, so academics and test prep. And at the end, we want to make sure that we save some time for a Q&A so we can make sure you guys are getting your questions answered. So there's a couple features on Zoom I wanted to bring your attention to before we get started. You can either chat directly to me if you have any questions, and I'll try to integrate those throughout the presentation, though mostly in the Q&A. And then there's also a Q&A feature if you prefer typing them there. Perfect. So yeah, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to chat me directly. And with that, I will pass it over to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Thank you for everybody for being here. I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk with us a little bit about the current state of test prep and academics. This is just a preview here on this slide of what we're going to be going over, but you'll get to see all of these in the coming slides, and we will send you the slide deck at the end if you'd like to be able to use it as a reference. So academics, where are we with distance learning? Many of us have been distance learning for a while. Some of us have had the opportunity to have students go back sometimes, and some of us are hoping that we can go back at some point this year. It depends on the school is kind of the long and short of it. So let's talk a little bit about the good news about distance learning compared to what we thought might happen back in the spring, and then maybe some of the bad news. So the good news is that I think we had some somewhat low expectations for how much learning would be able to get done in an online environment. And it turns out that student learning hasn't really been depressed in a meaningful way. So when we look at students who have been taking English and math tests that are standardized tests that kind of show their ability at this time of the year, and then we're looking at primarily middle grade, so I will say this with a grain of salt, 4th through 8th grade. We're seeing that their test scores are not actually meaningfully different than they were when they were in the classroom. So that is really good news. We were really worried about the impact that online learning would have on students. The other great news is that online tutoring continues to be a very positive thing for most students. So even though in-person tutoring is still better, if your student is getting tutoring online, they are getting a really good boost in their student achievement from that. And if they're, even if they're just getting online tutoring, by working with their teacher at school, things like that, it doesn't have to be from a private tutor, just that one-on-one interaction online is still really good. So we're really excited that those things have proven to be true, because we were concerned about how well those would work. And I know that in my own practice, I've seen that a lot, that my students have really acclimated to tutoring really well. And it's really heartening that we're able to get as much done as we used to in person. The bad news, I think, is a little bit more expected. Many schools have had to shutter their reopening plans. Not everybody. I know that there are some schools that are still planning to do some level of reopening and hybrid school, even in the Bay Area. But I think a lot of the high hopes that some of the public schools in our area have had to be tamped down, especially. The other bad news, and I think we were kind of expecting this, is that the social emotional impacts on students have not been as positive, especially for younger students. High school students, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag, but not being able to see people in person, not being able to engage in those extracurriculars has still been really tricky for students. So it's an ongoing thing. We're hopeful that the sooner we can get back in person, the better for those situations. So what about right now? Like literally right now, what are we dealing with with our high school students? Managing final exams is still a really big part of what high school students are dealing with at this time of year. Not everybody has final exams right now. We did an informal survey of our tutors to talk about what their students are seeing. And while most students do have final exams still, there are a lot of schools that have canceled them or have shifted them to final projects, final presentations, or just a unit test instead of a cumulative final. But because so many people still have final exams and they're trying to get through those right now, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can help our students manage their final exams. One thing that we recommend students do is create a study guide using their own notes. This is something that teachers sometimes do for them, but I really recommend that students do it themselves with their own notes and not with their teacher's notes. The act of creating a study guide tends to be a really good study tool in and of itself, and then you can use that later to test yourself and you know, you get kind of the double hit of, you know, making the study guide and actually using it. So I've got a link here to how to create a successful study guide, and that again will go out in the slide deck. Set achievable goals. So if you've got finals in a week, how much time is left? What do we need in order to get the goal grade? We need to decide how much time we think we need in order to get to that goal and whether we actually have that time to be able to set aside for that. So if your student's working with a tutor, they often will help you with this, but if they're not, I think just looking at, you know, all of the different classes that have finals right now and making a decision based on that is kind of the way to go. Then plan your time wisely. Don't say, okay, well, I will study for the Monday final on Sunday and the Tuesday final on Monday. That's cramming, obviously. And so cramming is not something that usually works for students. We find that it's better to kind of take a little bit of time each day. So there's something about sleeping on it that tends to help students too. So obviously we don't want them to stay up till 4 a.m. the night before and then not get any sleep and then take the final. It just won't go as well. So if you've still got time, encourage your students to not do the cramming that they often want to do. And then if finals have been canceled for your students, one of the things that we've been recommending to our own students is, again, to do that study guide, to come up with a practice final or something that they can do to just culminate what they've learned and summarize what they've learned. One thing that we've been doing at AJ is we've been using practice finals that we have on hand and giving them to students who don't have finals and saying, use this as a way of seeing how much you remember, how much you know from the school year. If you want, you can wait till winter break and do it, or you can do it in January as a diagnostic tool for the second semester. But we really believe in the summarization of learning, that's something that really helps students really lock in what they've learned for the semester, especially, you know, if you're going to be going off for 2 weeks and then coming back. That's something that we think is really important for students. So even if there's finals have been canceled, I really recommend coming up with some kind of way to summarize learning at the end. Okay, so then the very next thing after finals is, of course, winter break. And I think there are a lot of positive things we can do over winter break that are, you know, before I start with all the things we can do that are academic, you can also take a rest. I know that there are a lot of students who are looking forward to a break. They've been on screens for a long time. I think that's super reasonable. And you know, if they're planning to do that, get them off screens for the winter break, get them doing something where they can look, you know, more than 2 feet away from their noses. That's definitely going to be helpful. But if they're worried about what's been going on over the semester and they really need that time as catch-up time, I recommend one of these 3 things. So for number 1, catch up on academic content. If you took a practice final or a regular final and it didn't go so well, if you're a student who's struggling with that, I would say, you know, using that time to preview upcoming course content is great, or meeting with your tutor for a final exam debrief is also an excellent choice. Both of these things can really set you off on the right foot going into second semester. If that's not the case for you and you want something different, you could join an enrichment class, or we actually have book clubs for K-8 students, not for high school students right now, but I think something that can get you moving over winter break in a positive way, something that's not stressful, like finals, can be really nice. You can also get ahead on test prep, and this is something that Jared will talk about when we get to the test prep section. We have free SAT and ACT diagnostics. You can take them at home at any time, or you can take them proctored with us on Saturday mornings. They're awesome. They're a way for you to see how things are going with your student, and we can make an adjustment or a decision based on how they did about what they might need for test prep. We also have a 2-week intensive SAT group course over winter break. We have them, you know, I'm not sure if that one still has room, I'll ask Jared later, but we also have them over the course of the school year. So those are things that can be helpful for students. And then one thing that we've just started doing this year is previewing the AP test with mid-year AP test prep tutoring. This is something we're really excited about. Normally we do AP test prep in the spring, right before the test. Now we've got this mid-year AP prep that's like a preview of what you would do later in the year. And it gives your students the opportunity to see how did the first semester content go. We've really pared it down to just first semester content. And then you learn a couple of strategies that will be helpful on the test, especially strategies for free response questions, for example, that tend to need more practice than just a couple of weeks. So we're really excited about these. We have them for our major AP subjects, and that can be something that students do as well. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about our 4-credit courses. We've been doing these for a couple of years now. They've been really successful. We offer one-on-one WASC accredited course instruction. And this is something that students can do at their own pace. It's rolling admission, so we can start over winter break. And it's, because it's winter break, it's an ideal kickoff time because they're not right in the middle of classes. It's something that you do with a one-on-one tutor a few times a week, with a little bit of homework, and you can get through a course usually in far fewer hours than you would have to do at school. So if this is something that students are seeing, maybe they've got some concerns about how their classes are going and they would like to switch to something more customized, this is something that we can do. Okay, so getting to the academic side of test prep, updates on the 2021 AP exams. Officially, AP exams will be available to both distance learners and in-person students. And what does this mean? This is what the College Board has said on their website, that they are going to make sure that AP exams are available to both distance learners and in-person students. They have not explained what exactly that looks like. So from our perspective, and mine personally, what do we think this means? Distance learners will almost certainly have abridged free response exams. I don't see there being a very easy way for them to provide multiple choice tests to distance learners. This was something that they also skipped last year. In-person learners, it's hard to say. We're not sure if they're going to have full AP exams or if they'll try to keep them consistent with what distance learners are seeing. What I would recommend ultimately is that we prepare for a full exam and then we pivot according to what the official language looks like when we get there. For anybody who isn't familiar with the format of an AP exam, AP exams typically have a multiple choice component and a free response component. And last year when they had to move online, AP exams moved to just free response. And they did it in such a way that they were basically trying to prevent cheating. They didn't want students to be able to reach out to each other and easily share answers. And so instead of providing a multiple choice component, they only provided the free response. Now, there are certain ways they could make the multiple choice possible by mixing up question order, things like that, but I would be hard pressed to say that they'd be able to do that in the time they have. We'll see, obviously. But in-person learners will likely, it's hard to say, likely I'm speculating very heavily, but I can see how they would still be able to have full AP exams, which would include both of these components. If your student is currently distance learning at school, they may still be able to go in person for their exam. This is another thing that needs to happen with school districts and with private schools and everyone working to determine whether they can offer this. We know that there has been some offer of in-person testing for other tests at schools, so it's possible they'll be able to arrange this as well for AP exams. All this to say that the main thing that we need to focus on if we're trying to get a student prepared for the AP exam is to cover our bases, to make sure that our options are still open. And the way that we do that is we try to cover the most expansive version of the AP test, which is the full test. So there are a lot of test prep options available to students. If you're in an AP class, you should have access to AP Classroom through your class, which often has a ton of online resources. You can create, quizzes and things like that through AP Classroom. The teachers often do that for their students as well. There's regular spring AP test prep, which is what we've always done, where we do a couple of sessions prior to the test. Extended spring AP prep was something we started last year. And that was partly because we knew there were so many changes that a lot of students needed to shift gears. And so we wanted to make sure that they had the weeks and the time to really get used to what it was going to be like. But we've got one that will work well for either the full test or the free response only for this year. And then of course the mid-year AP test prep that I spoke about a little bit. So that was a lot of information really quickly. I know that there are probably some questions in the chat, and I know that Chelsea's been helpful in trying to aggregate those questions. I would love to answer them at the end, unless there's any really quick clarification questions that you see, Chelsea.
Yeah, I think we can go through them at the end. I think we'll aggregate them a little bit better together.
Sounds good. Okay, so again, you'll get access to this slide deck at the end of the presentation. We'll send it to you in a recap. And if for some reason we don't get to your question today, I'm sure we will, but if we don't, we will try our best to answer it in the recap email as well. With that, I will pass it over to Jared, who's going to talk about our other broad plate worth of standardized tests.
Thanks so much, Jessica. That was really rich information. I'm going to do my best to share my screen. Bear with me for just 1 second. All right. So that was a great segue from kind of AP test preparation to kind of the second part of our talk tonight, which will involve opportunities to take the PSAT, SAT, SAT subject tests. So just kind of as a quick preview of this segment of today's talk, I'm going to start by briefly describing similarities and differences between the SAT and ACT. Then we'll look at the current testing landscape, including an unprecedented January 2021 PSAT that many schools are offering. We'll then move on to subject tests and testing plans that can make sense for different types of students. And we'll conclude with strategies for how to optimally prepare for standardized tests in a moment of uncertainty. So we'll start with the SAT and ACT and kind of, what's covered on each of them, and just as importantly, what's not covered. So, the SAT is a very predictable exam. Part of the reason is that the content is the same from administration to administration. A great example of that is actually the writing and language section. Which is about half of the reading and writing score. Writing and language only examines students on their knowledge of 9 grammar rules. So once they know those rules and their predictable applications, we tend to see a pretty significant surge in the score there. So reading and writing comprise the first 800 points of the SAT. They contribute roughly equally to that reading and writing score. And the other half of the test is math. One of the things that's kind of unique about the ACT is that there is a no calculator allowed section followed by a calculator allowed section. But there too, they're not going to test students on everything they've learned in math in school. They pick a few key concepts from each of the major disciplines of math: arithmetic, algebra, geometry, data analysis. And the College Board tends to write the same types of questions over and over with slightly different numbers and wording. So the 2 math sections combine to the other 800-point score. The total score on the SAT, as it was back in the day when I took it, and I expect many of us in this virtual room took it, it's out of 1,600. There is an essay on the SAT that we generally encourage students to take. The essay is scored separately. It in no way contributes to the 1,600-point multiple choice score. And I'm asked almost every day by clients, by students, what's a good score on a test? What should I be shooting for? And the best wisdom that we can provide is that no test score is going to guarantee admission to a school. We really just want to make sure that we're posting scores high enough that allow a student to survive to the next round of consideration in the application process. But as ever, a good score is that which allows you to pursue the college of your dreams. So I think for, especially parents of sophomores and juniors in the room, this is a really good time of year to start looking at, kind of average scores for the sorts of schools that your students may be looking to attend. There is a ton of overlap between the SAT and the ACT. The content of the 2 exams is almost identical. The ACT goes a little bit further into math than the SAT does. Like the SAT covers up to maybe the first couple of months of Algebra 2, whereas the ACT goes a little bit deeper into Algebra 2. But it's the same grammar and punctuation rules tested on the ACT English section as on the SAT Writing and Language section. The ACT, though, is formatted a little bit differently. The ACT has an English section, which is like the grammar. It has a math section. It has a reading section, just like the SAT does, but it has a science section at the end of the test. Science is really a misnomer. It's a glorified data analysis section. It gives students charts and graphs and maps and trees, and it asks them some very basic questions about trends in the data. The scoring of the ACT is also a little bit different. It's kind of a funky score scale. Each section is scored out of 36 points, and one arrives at the composite score by averaging the 4 multiple choice sections. So the composite is also out of 36. Every school that accepts the SAT accepts the ACT and vice versa. Back when I was applying to college, there was kind of, a coastal bias in favor of the SAT. That has totally disappeared. In fact, we generally recommend that our students attempt both tests. If they start with the SAT, they can kind of hedge their proverbial bets with the ACT. And we've also engineered a really great hybrid preparation program that allows students to prepare for both tests simultaneously. What we typically do is we'll start with one test, for example, the SAT. We would do a comprehensive preparation, and then students might add just a handful of lessons to cover the key differences between the two tests as they gear up for the ACT. We would look at the different essay on the ACT. We might look at its science section, as well as strategies for time management. The ACT is a little more time pressured than the SAT is. On that sort of topic, almost 80% of students globally, before they prepare for either test, score pretty comparably. We find that, after students prepare for both tests, if there will be a divergence in the score, it'll kind of happen after they gear up for both and take them. So it goes back to kind of hedging one's bets. One could easily kind of transpose the knowledge that one gleaned in SAT preparation and apply it to the ACT and vice versa. Though there are a lot of families who are interested in figuring out, like, all right, between these two tests, which is the better one for my son or daughter? So for this reason, we created a hybrid diagnostic test that incorporates elements of both exams. So students can get exposed to some of the differences between like the types of questions and the pacing, and also get an apples to apples comparison of where a student is at on the SAT versus the ACT without having to take 2 4-hour tests. So our hybrid diagnostic exam takes basically the same amount of time as a full SAT or ACT. And as Jessica mentioned, we're offering virtually proctored practice tests at least once every weekend via Zoom. So students take their tests, we start the exam around the same time that the real test starts, and we proctor it. We have kind of proctors on the other end of the camera barking out timing instructions, so students can start to kind of internalize the pacing of these tests. But in terms of the actual differences, the SAT is less time pressured. There are fewer questions. So it's a little bit more challenging at the level of the question. Just to kind of hazard generalization, students who are really interested in problem solving, logic, puzzles, are generally really great candidates for the SAT. The ACT, by contrast, is more time pressured. There are a lot more questions, but that also means that each individual question isn't as precious on the ACT as it is on the SAT. The ACT is really great for students who like to move quickly through relatively straightforward questions and who have the kind of emotional maturity to detach from a question once they feel like spending additional time on it won't yield much benefit. But here too, we would be happy to host students for a hybrid diagnostic to really get a sense of whether one test or the other is going to be better for that particular student. So a question on a lot of people's minds, including my own, is sort of what the current landscape looks like for the SAT and ACT. So with kind of all of the recent convulsions in the standardized testing calendar, I just wanted to clarify what testing opportunities students will have in the spring to showcase their talents. We'll be outlining the upcoming dates for the SAT and ACT, as well as subject tests. So just in terms of spring exams, this is the landscape. The December SAT happened last week. The December ACT is set to happen this Saturday. So kind of coming up, the first standardized test of the spring is going to be the February ACT. The next ACT after that is April. The next after that is June. I didn't include it here, but there is also a July ACT. One thing that's kind of great is that the SAT and ACT are never held on the same day. So you can even see they kind of stagger the months. There's an SAT in March, SAT in May, and an SAT in June. I'll talk about subject tests in a minute, but for the moment, there will be no subject tests administered on the March SAT date. That's kind of always been the case, but every other month, some or all subject tests are offered. So this fall, a small handful of schools were able to conduct the October PSAT. For example, Harker was able to conduct the PSAT for its juniors, which was great. But a lot of high schools ended up canceling the traditional October administration of the PSAT. For that reason, a number of high schools are administering the PSAT in January 2021. I would strongly encourage, if you haven't already discovered the information, to ask whether your son or daughter's school is going to be hosting the PSAT. This PSAT is as legitimate as the traditional October PSAT. For example, the January PSAT is a qualifying test for the National Merit Competition or the National Merit Scholarship. Even for students who aren't gunning for the National Merit Prize, which is a very tough get in California, California has one of the highest minimum cutoffs to advance to the next round of the National Merit Competition. Most students aren't kind of gunning for the National Merit Prize. And for them, there's a lot of educational value in preparing for and taking the PSAT. At AJ, we generally look at the PSAT as an opportunity to get some real exposure to the test, to learn some foundational content and strategy to turn that PSAT into a really great learning and confidence building experience. A lot of students will do just kind of like a minimal preparation for the PSAT, just kind of like an appetizer course, so that they know what they're getting into when they take the PSAT. And then they'll often do kind of a bulk of the preparation before their first SAT or before their first ACT. Kind of another landmark in the testing landscape are subject tests. As some of you may know, subject tests are really short, hour-long, content-based exams that are very closely related to courses that sophomores and juniors typically take. For example, there's one called the Math 2C subject test that's like an Algebra 2 trig exam, ideal to take at the end of one's junior year. There's one for literature. There's one for each of the major foreign languages. There's one for US history, world history. SAT subject tests are generally taken by most students. The schools will vary in terms of like how many subject tests they might require or recommend. But we look at subject tests as an opportunity to really show off skills, to be able to show kind of beyond a grade in a course that one was able to apply all of that content knowledge they built up in their coursework to a rigorous exam. These are a little bit different than AP tests for a couple of reasons. SAT subject tests are college admissions exams in the sense that for schools that accept them, they'll be considered as part of a student's college application. AP tests, however, are actually not college admissions exams. They're a feather in one's cap if one does well in them. There are various prizes, but AP exams are really not part of a college application per se. We generally recommend, though there are exceptions, that students take maybe 1 or 2 subject tests. We find that every year there are colleges that kind of change whether they're requiring or recommending subject tests. And because students are generally best to take subject tests toward the end of an academic year in May or June, often students haven't finalized their college lists by the spring of their junior year, certainly not by the spring of their sophomore year. So we're big fans of just creating new opportunities for students. So I think it's a great idea to take 1 or 2 subject tests, just in case you end up kind of adding a school or two to a college list that requires or recommends them. So to try to put kind of all of this together, the various like SAT, ACT, SAT subject test opportunities, there are a lot of different testing plans that can make sense. The key is really finding a plan that optimizes a student's chance for success on these. So I've kind of laid out 3 typical plans. These are by no means the only. Kind of starting with a minimalist approach. This would be kind of ideal for students who are interested in, they're preparing for college, but they want to focus more on academics, on extracurricular activities. They perhaps may have taken the PSAT in October or likely will in January. Such students often take their first SAT in March or an ACT in April, and then they'll do subject tests in May or June. A slightly more common approach would also begin with the October or January PSAT, proceed to the SAT typically in March. It's a little bit more common for our students to transition to the ACT on the heels of the SAT. And we find that the best moment in the testing calendar to transition from the SAT to the ACT is between the March SAT and April ACT exams. It's because there are 4 weeks between them, which is kind of an ideal duration in which to look at the differences between the exams and get geared up for the ACT. Such a student might then take subject tests in May or June. We generally recommend AP related subject tests in May and non-AP related subject tests in June. And then such students will often use summer or early fall testing dates to retake anything that they want to nudge up before they apply to colleges. The July ACT, August SAT, September ACT, and October SAT are all in enough time for early action, early decision deadlines. And a slightly more intense approach that some of our students take. Here too, they'll start with the PSAT in October or January. They'll take the SAT in March. They will transition over to the ACT in April. They'll take subject tests in May. You can take up to 3 subject tests in one day. So it is possible to knock out all of one's subject tests on one Saturday afternoon and then retake an SAT and or ACT in June and retake, if necessary, 1 more time in the fall. And again, there are a lot of other approaches that will kind of mix and match some of the items on these 3, but I think this is a really good place to start. If you're just starting to kind of consider what a testing plan might look like for your student. The kind of the last big topic that I wanted to address is how to optimize success. when we're preparing for standardized tests in this kind of protracted moment of uncertainty. As I'm sure a lot of some high schools had to cancel their administrations of the SAT and ACT this fall. What we found as we've been working with students, since the first shelter-in-place order in March, is that in this ever-changing situation, a best practice is to prepare sooner rather than later, as we anticipate additional testing opportunities for students. I already laid out sort of like the official test dates that are on the horizon. But part of the reason that we at AJ are really confident that students are going to have a better chance of taking these tests this spring is that both the College Board and the ACT have advertised that they plan to roll out digital tests to afford students more testing opportunities in the spring. We don't know exactly when those tests will debut, but it is a promise that both the SAT and ACT have made. Additionally, a number of high schools, local high schools, are starting to plan school day SATs. Just in case March is canceled, for example, Palo Alto High School just announced late last week that they're going to be offering their own SAT on the Pali campus for its students in April. Palo Alto has really been a bellwether for a lot of other schools and districts, and we expect that a number of other high schools will follow Pali's lead. So we're confident that these tests are going to happen for sure, but the key is really positioning oneself to take advantage of new opportunities as they arise. What we wouldn't want to do, for example, is kind of, wait until we're really, really sure that the March SAT is going to happen, because we may not have that certainty until a couple of weeks before the test. So what we find is that laying a foundation of content and strategy that students can productively practice with as they mark time toward a test is kind of a better practice than kind of waiting to see what's going to happen and then trying to sort of cram everything at the end. Just kind of an additional word about UCs. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the UC system has gone test blind. Which just means that even if a student were to kind of submit SAT and ACT scores, they wouldn't really be considered as part of a student's application portfolio. So a question that I've been asked almost daily, is like, hey, my daughter is really applying to UC schools. Does she need to take these tests? I personally am a minimalist when it comes to test preparation. If one can get away with not doing it, fine. But just a couple of things to keep in mind. We're in an ever-changing situation where colleges are often changing messages every 6 months about what is required, what's recommended, score optional, score blind. Kind of with the notion that students may end up adding schools to their college list that could end up requiring or recommending these tests. It's often a good idea to take the test just in case. Certain students will apply exclusively to UC or CSU schools, and that's great. One thing that's actually kind of interesting is that in the UC system, there is an entry-level writing requirement that one can satisfy by taking like a 3-hour essay test, I think in one's first couple of weeks as a freshman, or by taking a semester-long expository writing course in one's freshman year. SAT and ACT scores can exempt students from these requirements. They're typically looking for a 680 combined on reading and writing on the SAT to be able to kind of pass a student out of that entry-level writing requirement, or a 30 on the sort of English and reading sections on the ACT. So there can be utility beyond college admissions, even for the UC system, in taking these tests. And we've also just found, over the last 15 years that we've done this, that the very skills we teach students in the context of the SAT and ACT kind of pay off in spades for their academic tests at school. to say nothing of the content of the exam. So we kind of look at test preparation, not all that distinct from academic. It's really a way of furthering a student's education and positioning them for later academic success. With that, I know that Chelsea has been kind of, amalgamating all of the questions that you guys have been asking. I will keep screen sharing. Just for those of you if you want to, talk to either one of us in more detail, we've included kind of our contact information here. Don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to chat with you about kind of any questions that don't get answered, at the bottom of the hour here. But Chelsea, let us know what our first question is and who you'd like to field it.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Jared, and thank you for everyone who's been putting questions in the chat and in the Q&A. For those of you who haven't already, feel free to start typing away. We'd really love to make sure we get to all of your questions. I've tried to put together what's been asked in the chat so far, but if I don't get exactly to your question, feel free to reach out again. So I think we'll start with Jared, since we were talking about the testing plans and how we want to be adaptable in the spring. If we come across a situation where the testing centers are full, what would you recommend that people do?
It's a really great question, actually. And it's something that we've been asked well before COVID times. There's actually something called standby testing for the SAT and ACT. And it works just like kind of standby at an airport. You kind of show up the morning of, you keep your fingers crossed. I can't make any guarantees, but I can aver personally. I've never heard of an AJ student who attempted standby testing, who wasn't admitted to a testing room. Generally speaking, these testing rooms are kind of underbooked rather than overbooked. And there are always, a couple of students in each testing room who just don't show up that day for whatever reason. So even should these things be full, there are standby opportunities, as well as those high school day tests that I'm sure we're going to be seeing more and more of, that I think will both sort of take the pressure off standard SAT and ACT dates. So there'll be fewer students taking it in March because they'll have an opportunity to take it at their local school, we hope. So I think even if centers are full, there's still opportunities to take these tests.
Fantastic. And kind of moreover on that question, do you expect that the centers that are currently available are the entirety of what centers will be available, or do you envision more being added as we go along?
That's such a great question. So one thing that's been interesting, the ACT has been a lot more creative with creating testing opportunities for students. Part of the reason that so many administrations of these tests were canceled in the fall and last spring is that they're traditionally held at high schools. And if the high schools aren't open to teach students, they're generally not also conducting an SAT or ACT. The ACT started offering what it calls pop-up testing centers that are not in high schools. A great example of that, the ACT started offering its test at the Hyatt in Burlingame, close to SFO, which I actually thought was a brilliant move because the Hyatt wasn't closed for business, the way that schools that typically administer these tests are. So actually a lot of our ACT students were only able to take their tests in the fall because of the Hyatt. And I mention it, because the Hyatt is like a primo testing site. If you can snag a spot there for the February ACT, the April ACT, but I also mention it because I think it's a harbinger for even more testing opportunities going forward. It's just a matter of time until the College Board kind of catches up with its competitor, the ACT. So everyone is trying to get a little bit more creative and create opportunities outside of high schools.
Fantastic. So we talked a little bit about the testing plans and what might make sense for certain students. Given those testing plans, how long do you recommend that students take to prepare before these tests?
It's such an important question. A lot of things can work, but I would say if I had to kind of ballpark it, the sweet spot, we tend to see the most dramatic score improvements when students begin the preparation somewhere between 12 to 13 or 10 to 13 weeks before the exam. When we comprehensively prepare a student for the test, we generally meet with them somewhere between, 9 to 11 times. So starting somewhere 10 to 13 weeks in advance can make a lot of sense. The other thing that's interesting about the spring, though, is that a lot converges for juniors, right? We have subject tests, we have final exams, we have APs, we have SAT and ACT, and we find that as we get deeper into second semester, particularly of junior year, lessons tend to get pushed back. Students will get kind of stressed out. They might get sick. I think another great reason to really start the preparation sooner rather than later, so we actually have the flexibility in the schedule if we need to skip a couple of weeks because things are really intense academically, or if we need to kind of retool a testing plan due to new developments.
Fantastic. We've talked a little bit about our junior class our senior class and how the schools have changed their testing requirements for those students. Do we have any sense of our juniors, our class of 2022 and beyond, what testing will look like for them and those requirements?
It's ever evolving. I'm keeping a really close eye on like kind of what the UC system is doing, what a lot of kind of major private schools are doing. But what I'm finding as I do this research is that the messaging is kind of changing from month to month and school to school. So I would encourage, definitely hop on the website of the schools that your children may be interested in. They generally make no secret of like testing requirements. And I would keep refreshing those pages because new information is coming out all the time.
Fantastic. Well, we have a few more test prep questions, but I do want to make sure we spend a little bit of time on academic as well. So I want to switch over to Jessica really quickly. And Jessica, kind of a similar question, like how do we know what students need to do to prepare for AP tests, and how do we know when to start for those and what to do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. One of the things that we do with our AP students is we start with a diagnostic. All of our AP programs have a short, usually about an hour-long assignment where we can assess what students already know, what they're capable of in terms of just testing ability, and what they may not know. And in doing that, we can kind of get a sense of whether they're on track, their class is keeping them up to speed with where we would expect them to be at that time of year, or if they're falling behind, or if they're way ahead, they're doing really great. So a lot of these decisions are made based on how the student presents to us on the diagnostic. If a student is kind of right where we expect them to be, let's kind of take the middle road for a second, we would generally say that a regular test prep plan is going to work. So that would be starting probably in March for a May AP exam, planning for about 6 weeks or so of sessions. That usually ends up being around 4 sessions, but it gives us some wiggle room. It lets us have that spring break opportunity if they have that to just take a break, or if their classes, like Jared was saying, there's a lot converging at the end of the year for juniors, and so we want them to have the opportunity to make decisions to cancel one thing and focus on another thing. So it also depends on how many APs the student wants to prepare for. And I think that can sometimes lengthen the time because we want to take more time to really develop a lot of different AP abilities. If for some reason a student doesn't feel like their AP class is really getting them prepared, and that's something that we actually have a pretty good sense of at AJ Tutoring. Our tutors have seen classes that have really gotten their students as far as they need to get, and where they should be right now, or where they should be in February, or where they should be in March. And so we can kind of get a sense of whether they're on track or not, even if the student isn't quite sure, because this is their first time through that. So I recommend talking to somebody about a diagnostic with us if that's something that they're really interested in. And that's something that we're prepared to do even over winter break.
Fantastic. Well, back to Jared, we got a number of questions around subject tests, and I think Jessica may be able to provide a little bit of extra clarity here as well. But are there any subject tests that you guys recommend for, blanket recommend, or ones that follow certain classwork very closely?
I have a personal, 2 favorites. I would say the most coachable 2 subject tests are the Math 2C and literature exams. Part of what makes the Math 2 exam so coachable is that like the content is utterly predictable. They write the same questions over and over, and it's a really great capstone test to kind of take after Algebra 2 Trig or after pre-calculus. It's probably one of the best things that we do as an organization, honestly, is preparing students for the math subject test. I like the literature exam as well. It's the most democratic of all of the subject tests in the sense that there is no content. There's nothing in particular a student needs to have read to get every question right. It's a test of pure interpretive skill. You get some reading passages and questions about what the passage means. The other thing that makes Math 2 and literature so coachable is that a lot of the same strategies that we coach for the SAT and ACT apply directly to those subject tests.
Fantastic. Jessica, anything?
I'll just add a couple things. I totally agree with what Jared said. The other subject tests tend to be easier if you have just finished the class. So there are a couple of areas where people tend to be well positioned. Obviously, the math for the Math 2 exam is really helpful because a lot of juniors and sophomores are in classes that lead right into that. For sophomores, I know this is a junior parent night, but I'll just say in case there are any sophomores in the room or parents of sophomores, if they're in honors chemistry, taking it at the end of honors, taking the chemistry exam right at the end of the honors chemistry can be a great way for a sophomore in particular to kind of get their feet wet with subject testing and with any testing because it's a 1-hour exam. It gets them kind of exposed to what the test prep process is like. So that's definitely one that we also recommend. And obviously, if you're a junior in honors chemistry, same thing. AP chemistry definitely connects to, although the subject test tends to be actually slightly more aligned to honors chemistry. So yeah, I would say that most of the other tests tend to be more content specific, and it's more difficult, although not impossible, to take them beyond the end of class. So if you finish the class in June and then you try to take it in December, it can require a little bit more review. It's definitely, again, it's something we've had to do because we've had a lot of students who unfortunately couldn't take the June tests last year. And so we prepared them for August and then prepared them from October. And we definitely, tried to carry some students through to whatever test they were able to take. And it's still very possible we can keep students up to speed and we can give them that without having to meet, weekly all the way there. But yeah, I would agree that those two tests that Jared said are perfect for people who are looking for tests that may not necessarily require a lot of immediate content.
But I think even more broadly, the key for subject tests or like choosing which subject tests to take is playing to student strengths. Someone is just crushing it in French 3 or French 4, take that French subject test. So it's kind of like taking an inventory of, as we get into second semester for sophomores and juniors, like what classes are we doing really well in? What might we not mind spending like a little bit more time preparing for? And typically the work that we do with students for subject tests is fairly minimal because they're only 1 hour long. They don't present the same kind of endurance challenge as the SAT and ACT do. We'll often work with students for somewhere between 3 to 5 lessons to get them fully prepared for an individual subject test.
Fantastic. Thank you. Just a really quick question. You mentioned that you can have up to 3 in a day. Is 3 too much in a day? Is it reasonable?
It's such a good question. It kind of depends on that overall testing plan. For example, one cannot take the regular SAT and subject tests on the same date, nor would one want to. So it's kind of a blessing. But, for example, let's say you're planning to take the June SAT, the regular SAT. Well, that probably means as a junior, we're going to be planning on all of our subject tests in May. Whereas for students who want to take multiple subject tests, a decision might be, well, maybe we do 2 in May and 1 in June or vice versa. But it's really going to kind of depend on like that overall testing plan.
Fantastic. Let's see, we discussed the PSAT briefly and the National Merit Scholarship. We had a few questions about, what is that and who does that make sense for?
Absolutely. So the National Merit Competition kicks off with the PSAT. In California, one has to get almost a perfect score to be advanced to the semifinal round of the National Merit Competition. So again, it's a qualifying test. Even if you were to get like a perfect score, it doesn't like guarantee that you'll get the whole National Merit Prize, but it advances you to the next round. Students who don't kind of hit that very high threshold that they set in California are also eligible for what's called a commendation, for kind of like a top score that's not, you know, the tippity top of the range. And, you know, there's sort of like official recognition for, you know, people who are commended for their PSAT performance. But beyond that, you know, the National Merit Prize, for the few students nationally who win it every year, it's certainly a feather in their cap. It's something you can kind of brag about in college applications. And, you know, there's a very kind of small purse of like tuition money that students might be eligible for if they actually win the competition. You know, but ultimately we kind of look at like the SAT is a college admissions test. The PSAT is not. Like, even if one were to get like a perfect score on the PSAT, that wouldn't be necessarily one's SAT.
Fantastic. Well, we're almost reaching the end of our time. I think we'll do one more question. Sorry for everyone who we weren't able to get to your question, but like I said, we'll send out a slide deck and a recording here, and we're happy to answer any questions one-on-one. So for our last question, I think we've gotten a few questions on, you know, what does it mean to be test optional and how should we interact with that?
Thanks so much for those of you who asked that question. I think the nomenclature is important. There's sort of test optional versus test blind. Test optional has been the way a lot of schools have gone over the last 9 months. What test optional means is that if you don't take an SAT or ACT, you're not disadvantaged in the process. Totally cool with admissions if you don't take it. But what score optional also means is that schools will look at the scores that you send if you choose to send them. I think one of the exciting things about more schools going score optional is that there's less of a risk for students. Like, if you do really, really well on a test, by all means, share those scores with those schools. But if you don't do that well and it's a score optional school, there's no disadvantage to not submitting the scores. Test blind is a little bit different. So test blind is kind of the direction that the UC system has gone in kind of an about face a couple of months ago. Test blind means even if you submit scores, no one's going to look at them.
Fantastic. All right, well, everyone, that was all the time we have today. Thank you so much for all of your questions. As we mentioned, we'd be happy to answer those one-on-one if we didn't quite get to your question. And we'll be sending out a recap again today. Thank you, Jessica and Jared, for your time today, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.